Hi, everyone, and welcome to In Conversation with Psychosocial and Ethics. My name is Heather Badnock, and I'm a non-directed living liver donor, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Really looking forward to it. Just a reminder that you can submit your questions on slido.com using the event code PM2. Also, just so you know, today's session is being recorded and it will be available on the Center for Living Organ Donation's YouTube channel. So really glad to be joined today by a fantastic panel. And just before we introduce our panelists, I'll give you a little bit of my backstory. So I originally applied to the Center for Living Donation to be a donor several years ago, was thrilled to be accepted, and I left it up to the transplant team to choose the recipient who needed it the most. So I donated 22% of my liver to a child who I've never met. I don't know who they are, and they don't know who I am. It was absolutely the best thing I have ever done, best decision I ever made, and really glad to be with you here today. So let's meet our panelists. Shall we start with Mark?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Guset. I'm the manager of the Department of Spiritual Care at UHN. And I guess my experience and our experience generally in spiritual care tends to be with prospective deceased donors, families of deceased donors, sometimes with the recipient or families of recipient, but certainly, generally speaking, with the deceased donor or family. And it's good to be with you today and hopefully to be able to share some of my experience and the experience of spiritual care and how that profession can be helpful through this process.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Also on the panel today, we've got Jed Gross.
Hi, my name is Jed. I am the transplant lead from our bioethics program at UHN. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I have a law degree and I moved here about 3.5 years ago. Where I enter the picture is generally when the transplant team is grappling with what is the best way to proceed. However, we're available to patients and family members as well. You can just call UHN and ask to speak with a bioethicist.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jed. And also rounding out the panel today is Sonali.
Hi, my name is Sonali Patel. I'm the social worker for the liver transplant team on the recipient side. I've been with the program for 13 years now, so I've seen a lot of recipients come through our program. I work primarily with the patients and their families, and sometimes the family members are their donors. So I do get to see a little bit of that in the early stages. And I'm going to do my best today to speak on behalf of the liver donor social worker as well. So bear with me if I don't have all the details, but I will try my best to answer any questions you may have from that perspective. I'm looking forward to today.
Thank you so much to all of you. We thought that we would start with a little bit of information leveling, knowing that folks who have joined us today may not know the program in detail. So one of the things we wanted to start with, because we know we're going to dive into it, is a little bit about how the screening process works. And I can speak to what that screening process looks like for someone who is a prospective liver donor. So anyone who's interested in being a liver donor applies to UHN, and that application is screened by a nurse. It's an 11-page health history. It offers a lot of detail. And of those who apply, if their health looks, at least from the paper copy, suitable, then they're invited to in-person screening, which involves a number of steps from blood test to chest x-ray, MRI, CT, social work, psychiatry, meetings with the transplant team. It is incredibly thorough, and the safety of the donor is incredibly important. If a person is accepted to be a donor, and for liver donor applicants, it's about 1 in 8. If you're accepted to be a donor, which for me left me in a hallway crying of joy to be accepted to be a donor, then you go on to have your surgery scheduled. You have a wonderful nap while the transplant team involves you in saving a life. You wake up and are waited on in the hospital for 5 or 6 days. Your liver is already growing back at that point, and we go home and recover from there. That's a quick snapshot of what it entails to go through the process to be a liver donor. And we wanted to hand it over to Jed to tell us a little bit about the difference between what is, when we use these terms, a directed donor versus a non-directed donor. What are those?
Sure. A directed donor is someone who is donating their kidney or part of their liver to a specific individual. They usually have an existing relationship like a family member, but it may also be possible to anonymously donate to someone who has made a public appeal. A non-directed donor is someone who essentially says, I want my donation to go to whoever is the best match. Organ donation after death is generally non-directed. It's also possible to be a living non-directed donor.
That's perfect. Thank you, Jed. And Sonali, can you give us some insight into the process for recipients?
Sure. So the recipient process is the medical evaluation is very similar to what the donors go through. The only difference is they go through it first. So we have the entire medical evaluation for liver and kidney recipients, any organ recipient, to go first, which includes all of those, ultrasounds, CT scans, surgical consults, either a nephrologist, kidney specialist, or a hepatologist that's a liver specialist. Breathing tests, every part of your body is looked at, and social work is part of the end of the evaluation. And we really just look and give a snapshot or get a snapshot of who you are, what resources you need to plan for, the education piece, providing some support around this big ordeal. And just make sure that everybody is in the right frame of mind and in the right place to go forward with transplant. And then we get to meet together to make a decision about going forward for transplant. And then that's the point where the donors get to start their evaluation. So we always start the recipient evaluation first.
It sounds so thorough. Like there's so much that happens behind the scenes.
It's a well-oiled machine.
Now, Jed, sometimes things come up along the way. So, and sometimes these are ethical concerns. And so when in the transplant process does ethics get called in, and what sorts of issues are coming up?
We generally get called to make to guide discussions of forward-looking policies, or when a situation arises that doesn't quite fit within the normal procedures that we anticipate. So let's say someone wanted to donate their organs to patients in their city, but it's not possible, or the transplant program has concerns about the fairness of that arrangement and the precedent it would set. I might receive a consult to figure out what we can do and guide that discussion. Specifically with reference to living donation, the situations in which ethics is likely to be engaged would be when we have a donor with a complex medical history or social situation. Perhaps someone in need of a transplant has a relative overseas who's interested in donating, or when we're innovating and thinking about an unusual arrangement. We had recently a paired liver exchange involving 4 individuals. So there was an anonymous non-directed donor pair who were incompatible, so they couldn't do a direct transplant, and then an unmatched individual who benefited from a transplant. One of the great things about being at a place that has a deep and wide team is that we can figure out how to do these things in the best way possible.
It's so interesting because I don't think, we think about medical settings and we think about the range of teams that are on call in a medical setting that respond, sometimes quickly to changing situations. And I don't think we fully appreciated until we started talking to you that in fact, ethics is very much on call as well.
We're not quite embedded in the transplant program, but we're always on call and we're welcome and work together closely. So hopefully these calls are not coming in the middle of the night with that sense of urgency, because with enough forethought, we can usually work together as a team and avoid the midnight crunch.
Yeah. And there's so much that comes into a transplant decision and support that's needed along the way. And Mark, there's a role for spiritual care in that. There's a role for spiritual care in transplant. How would you describe what that role looks like, Mark? Mark, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, Heather, normally we are introduced as a service, unfortunately, often at a time of crisis or trauma, in which families are looking at the potential of a deceased donor and the opportunity question as to organ donation. And so the events that often lead up to that are traumatic, they're recent. So there is, families are still in a state of shock, processing a lot, and then being introduced to the idea of possibly using their loved one, being able to use to retrieve the organs. And so I think there some of it, and certainly social work would share in this as well, as supporting families through that decision making. From a spiritual care point of view, it can often be, if they are adherents to particular faith tenets, what would the religious body say about it? In those cases, our best case is if we can connect them with somebody, a religious leader. Even if I might know the answer, it just has more value coming from of the same religious background. There's that security that this is correct information. But from a spiritual point, it's also what helps families make sense and meaning out of what is often a very traumatic event in their lives. And it's often a way to bring something, as trite as the expression is, something positive out of a very negative experience.
So in this really difficult place and time, there is support for families as they come to terms with what has happened, but also to give some sort of meaning to the death that they're facing of their loved one.
Most definitely. And in the best case scenario, we would have already been involved, because there are practitioners within the different clinical programs and certainly within ICUs and the critical care program. So hopefully there's some relationship already with the family before this gets introduced as well. That helps because there's a trust level there, and families maybe feel a little bit more open. We've had an opportunity maybe to hear some of what are the families or patients' values, how they've lived their lives, what's important to them, and all that goes into the decision making. We are not there to guide the decision. We are there to support them in whatever decision they come to.
That support is so important, and there's so many moving pieces, aren't there, in this whole process. And when we think about some of the different processes that are coming into play, and I think about the living donation side of things, we know that there's some separation that exists there, right? When we, Jed and Sonali, so there are different teams that work with the living donor when they apply versus the recipient. And so even though they're moving towards the same sort of transplant goal, why is it that the living donor team is separate from the recipient team?
Sure. When transplant programs organize living donor transplants, we want to establish a relationship of trust with both the donor and the recipient. You need to be able to share sensitive medical information with us, And if either person has reservations about proceeding, we need to know that. In order to avoid conflicts of commitment, where one practitioner feels pulled by their dedication to more than one patient, it's best to have dedicated teams working with the donors and recipients respectively.
It's really good to know.
I'd probably add too that we have to remember that donors themselves are, when they're coming forward as potential donors, they are also patients of our program, and we want to ensure that everybody's confidentiality is also maintained. So we don't ever want there to be a potential of an overlap outside of, once that match is made, making sure that it's a fit for each other, but really treating everybody as their own individual and not having that overlap. Which then Jed mentioned, we don't want to compromise the importance of one over the other because of conflicting values.
That makes so much sense. Like, as a donor, I always felt like I had a safe space where I could talk to the team, where, there was a nurse that was dedicated to me who, as far as I know, wasn't engaged with the recipient side of things. And so I felt like I could ask whatever I had to ask, and that I knew that they were looking out for me as a donor. Like, I really felt like well cared for. And on the recipient side of things, Sonali, what would you say are some of the most common questions that come up?
From, like, in general, about, are you asking in terms of just
like as they move towards transplant, there must be so much that goes on that you see as a social worker, and I know you have many years of experience, and so, but if you had to highlight some of the common questions that come up.
I think everybody wants to know when they're going to feel better. How long is it going to take until I'm back to normal? What is it going to be back to normal the way it was before? Is there a new normal? A lot of people will say, how much is this going to cost me? And so we really talk about what the resources are, what is available through OHIP, and what may be an out-of-pocket cost. I think, what's it going to be like after? Am I going to get my life back? Am I going to get back all the things that I've lost through the illness process? Because then what's the point if I'm not going to recover, and if I'm not going to be okay? What
do recipients feel like? I'm really touched by that. What do recipients feel like they lose in the process of being so sick?
Well, so just even now during COVID, some of the things I'm hearing about are my patients who are isolating from their grandchildren for fear of infection. And so what a loss that can be. But I think even before COVID, we know that, with kidney, it's dialysis 3 times a week or more. With liver disease, the symptom burden is so high, and just that inability to participate in activities of daily living as a personal care measure, but also just social activities, and being able to comfortably go to a family wedding or to a family function without, having the symptom burden impact that is such a huge loss. And it varies. Obviously, some have more symptoms than others, but there is a very big toll that these illnesses take on our patients and their families, because sometimes the families need to stay home and be the caregivers, so they too are missing out. So there can be a long process of missed opportunities and missed experiences leading up to transplant. And so there's just a lot of optimism and hope about what will be gained or what will be taken back after transplant.
Yeah, Mark.
When you talk, Heather, about the questions that sometimes comes up with donors or the recipient, is often a profoundly spiritual one, because who am I if I have this organ in me that's come from another person? What does that do to the questions are, how do I incorporate this into a sense of my being, my personhood, the person I am? So those are profound. There's a psychological component to that, but there's also a profound spiritual element to that around the personhood I understand myself to be. And so there's a change there. Donors will often talk about, or the recipients, often talk about what's that like for them to continue to live. uh, and to know that they're living as the result of the death of someone else. And that juxtaposition of both being relieved, happy, gratitude, but also tending sometimes to a little bit sense of guilt because of the death of someone, and recognizing that. And it's often just being able to talk that out.
How do people process that, knowing that in some cases, if they don't have a living donor, that it's certainly not a death that they have caused in any way, shape, or form, but that there is a death that allows them to live?
And that can vary. And I mean, it certainly does vary. So from my experience, just something I kind of remember is one that helps us a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the particular person, even though they don't know it, who the person is, but they can still kind of direct that energy, their thoughts to that. For others, it's kind of feeling that they are able in some way to continue the life of the person. And certainly donor families will say that, like deceased donor families will say, this allows the life of this person to continue in some form.
So I hear sometimes recipients talk about an honoring, like they honor the life in some way that has contributed to theirs.
Yes.
Yes. Sonali.
I just wanted to add the other piece that I often talk to families about who are struggling with how to honor this unknown deceased donor is really just care for the organ, to understand the gift that another family, or the loss that another family has had in the gift that they've given, and to do your very best to honor that by taking care of the organ in the best way that you can, and not letting that gift go to waste.
Yeah, that makes such good sense. Yeah, it's really touching when sometimes we see online the things that they're doing to honor their unknown donor. It's really special. In terms of some of the most frequently asked questions that that living donors ask, and we see these come up in a lot of there's online support groups, discussion groups. It happens on Twitter, it happens on Facebook, all across the board. And I think one of the top questions that we hear is about the recovery process. The screening process is really well spelled out. People understand that. People understand what happens during the surgery. The teams are so incredibly, really good at explaining what's going to happen, but the recovery feels like such an unknown for donors, and it is so different across donors. And so we know that some people may have complications that include, nausea or pain, or sometimes other things that keep them in hospital for longer. Some of us kind of spring out and go home, and so it really varies. And but they're fascinated always to know how quickly it starts regenerating. And I know that Dr. Grant is retired, but I often reference, and I think people are fascinated to know that the liver starts regenerating on day 2 after surgery. And it's at full function, if I'm remembering correctly. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, but full function by day 10. And then an MRI about the 3rd month confirms that it's actually regrown. But that's what we hear the most often is, what's my recovery going to be like? And so we try to answer that as best we can. Now, I feel like you've each touched on some different relationship dynamics. And so, when we see different donor recipient dynamics, and donors will tell you that the desire to donate can be powerful. We also hear about recipients that hesitate to accept the donation, living donation from a family member. We hear about a dad maybe hesitant to receive part of his daughter liver. And so when you talk about, relationships in transplant, what are some of the things that come to mind for you? And if we start with Jed, what comes to mind in terms of relationships on the living donation side of things?
Well, there's no one right kind of relationship between a living donor and recipient. Initially, transplant really got off the ground with kidney transplants between identical twins because at the time that was what the technological capabilities permitted. But we've seen people donate to family, to emotionally related individuals, and to whoever needs it most. In some cases, people donate out of a sense of duty almost, that they want to give back. In other cases, people say that they're donating because they just want to do it and want to know that they helped someone. We don't try to tell people what is the right or wrong reason to donate as long as it's a free choice. That's one of the wonderful things about being in a system that recognizes the diversity of human relationships.
That's really interesting. And Mark, you touched on, some of the notion of gratitude and needing someone, in some cases someone needs to pass for the recipient to live. And has this come up during COVID as well? Has this shifted or been different in any way?
One of the uniquenesses, Heather, around through this time of COVID has been that a lot of the situations, circumstances that bring about organ donation after death have been scaled down. So with a lockdown, we haven't, there hasn't been the same mobility, we haven't been socializing, we haven't been traveling. And so there's in some ways been less organ donor available. And so one of the conversations one of my team had with a prospective recipient was this pull within them because they were on a list, a waiting list. The time gets longer because less organs, and then an organ became available, and then the person talking about feeling guilty that they were almost wishing the demise of someone. I mean, they weren't directly, but that emotional response, right? And so how do you come to terms with that, from a spiritual perspective? There is a sense of gratitude, there's a sense of sadness. So maybe there's both the gratitude and the grieving that happen. And some people they really do sense that grief. They also know that somewhere there's a family involved that's tremendously grieving because it's been a traumatic event. And so it's about holding both of those from a spiritual perspective and allowing both to be expressed and maybe even facilitated, ritualized, symbolized.
It's such a range of emotions that maybe people who haven't been part of the transplant process may not appreciate, that receiving an organ is not just a celebration, that it's life-saving, but at the same time, there is such a range of emotions that a recipient experiences in that moment, but possibly forever as they come to terms with what they've experienced. And Sonali, you see in all your years as a social worker a range of relationships. And as we were preparing for this panel, you talked about it being, in a way, some of your favorite conversations. Tell us about that.
Well, I see recipients and their families before living donation is really a reality. Some families will have already come with a plan in place and who's the donor, and others have had conversations within their families, but they haven't come to terms with anything. So, I mean, relationships are complex, and they're loving, they're love, hate, all those kinds of things. And I just had a wonderful opportunity of being part of so many family discussions around this. So Heather, you alluded to, the parent who doesn't want their child to donate. And, I've had lots of conversations with both sides, the parents and the children, and the being able to play the devil's advocate a little bit. And my role is never to convince anybody to do anything, but just to support that thought process. And, the parent who doesn't want their child to donate maybe is not thinking about the consequence to the child if they're not able to donate. And for some of our patients, unfortunately, they won't make it to transplant without a living donor. And so that ability for a child to give their parent life so their parent can be around for their, the rest of the milestones. I've spoken to spouses when there's little children involved and the one wants to donate to the other, but what are the considerations? And we'll never say no to a donor, but there's things that need to be considered and thought about that in the heat of the moment and in the passion, if you will, of wanting to help your loved one, sometimes you don't always think about it. And then, of course, there's also the not so positive dynamics where there's almost an expectation that a family member will step up to donate. And that doesn't happen because of long-standing issues. As I said, family dynamics are complex. And then the guilt sometimes of a potential donor who really wants to donate, but either through their own health issues or fears of surgery, all sorts of different things, aren't able to. And, working through some of that grief on top of the potential grief of a parent being sick. And there's so many layers and so much complexity, but it's really is such an honor to be part of those conversations and to, again, not guide or make any decisions, but just to support people through their different emotions and their different thought processes. So it's really a fascinating place to be and an amazing support to be able to offer.
Yeah, what a range of things that people experience, and there's thankfully these supports available to help them through, and things. We know also that these processes and the supports available and things that happen on the transplant side change over time. I had the pleasure last month of giving blood with a pretty special guy and having a long chat with Kevin Gosling. And he was the first non-directed liver donor in Canada, maybe also in North America. And so he approached UHN and asked to give part of his liver without a recipient in mind. And this was in 2004. And the team was, he says, open to the conversation, but it certainly wasn't, there wasn't a process in place, right? And so his application to give led to a lot of discussions. It took 16 months, as I recall, as he describes it. And he was so enthusiastic, and it was his also continued diligence and enthusiasm that made it really possible. Plus the team was so open to it. UHN is so innovative in so many ways, thankfully. And so he was ultimately accepted. He knows very little about his recipient. He does know that he saved the life of a 10-year-old boy. But he was, at that time doing something really groundbreaking. And he was, non-directed donor number 1. And what's kind of neat is that UHN keeps track of non-directed donor, liver donor numbers. And so we each actually know which number we are. So like I'm non-directed liver donor number 55. And as far as we know, the most recent one to give was number 71, if not 72. And I had the pleasure of mentoring that person. And so what was hotly debated in 2004 is now quite common and has been done 71 times. So and is done really in many cities now around the world. So Jed, thinking about the evolution, and how these things evolve over time, what is being discussed in transplant these days? What is making its way from maybe not so common to more common, or what doesn't have a process that's receiving a process?
Yeah, thinking about the stories that Sonali and Mark and you shared, there's a theoretical aspect to this job and a human one. What's really rewarding is when we work on something that involves wide-ranging discussion and careful planning, like that paired exchange, and then we see a good outcome for the patients. What gives me hope, short of being able to grow organs in a lab, is the potential for further innovations like advanced donation, where someone donates now with the understanding that should their loved one need an organ in the future, they would have access at the end of a chain, for example, of donations. this is the kind of thing that potentially can enable more people to benefit from transplant, but it needs to be done thoughtfully to ensure that we don't have a bottleneck in the system. For example, kind of the equivalent of people having frequent flyer miles that aren't actually good on a flight. Hopeful that we can find a way to expand transplantation through that type of creativity.
So how, I mean, there's different possible ways that this could work. Like I hear about sort of ticket systems or voucher systems. So what are some of the possible models here?
I think one of the possible models is that someone would donate now as a living donor who perhaps anticipates that, say, their grandchild may need a transplant. There's nothing wrong with that as a motivation, just like you can donate directly to a family member. And then they would receive a non-transferable voucher effectively, so that later on, if that individual or a member of their immediate family needs a transplant, let's say a kidney, they might be placed at the end of one of these kidney chains that starts with a current non-directed donor and therefore produces one net kidney in the system. What we want to make sure is that we're not disadvantaging people who are already, in some sense, disadvantaged. So one of the things that has been discussed where this concern has been particularly salient is the idea of allowing relatives of living donors to tap into the deceased donor pool. The thinking there is if you have someone who's interested in living donation, but they're not a match, maybe the system should take that organ, so to speak, in exchange for giving the recipient priority access to a matching deceased donor organ. The danger is that some patients who really do not have the social network or for other reasons do not have access or good access to living donation are also waiting for a deceased donor organ, and we want to make sure that everything we're doing is consistent with the principles of fairness and allocation based on medical need.
It's so interesting to hear like the considerations that come into this in terms of like the benefit, but fairness, but the recognition that there aren't enough organs to go around. So how do we make this system work? So maybe in a year's time, we're going to have this conversation again, and you're going to give us a really neat update on, because these are conversations that are happening at UHN, but also around the world, right?
That's right, and I would be happy to rejoin in a year and provide an update.
We're going to shift to questions and answers because there's really thoughtful questions that have been submitted, and we're really looking forward to talking about them. But also, I really would love to hear from you. You know, you work so hard and you're clearly so dedicated to everything that you do. And what gives you hope when you think about transplant? So as you think about, the favorite part of your job or something that makes you smile and sometimes it's dark times, but what is it that keeps you going and gives you hope? And I'm going to ask Mark first.
Thanks, Heather. I'm just going to rephrase it a bit because I get the essence of what you're saying, but it's a little bit, when you hear my answer, it would feel awkward to talk about it as being what brings you, put a smile on your face or joy, but it's more about meaning and fulfillment. So for me, it comes from being invited into people's lives at the most vulnerable, traumatic, difficult times, and being given that honor of being invited in to walk with them through what is a horrible experience. And it doesn't always turn out, I mean, in this case, there's a positive and also a negative. So it's not about always happy endings. But it really is that, in spiritual terms, walking through very sacred spaces with people and being honored with that.
I appreciate that reframing. That's very well said. Yeah. How about you, Sonali?
I echo what Mark said. I think it is about being invited into these families and into these stories and into these lives. I actually, there are days that I have a lot of fun with the people that I meet. We talk about places they've traveled. We've talked about books that they've read, these amazing experiences that they've had that have nothing to do with their liver or kidney disease or their need for a transplant or their hope for a transplant, just the amazing lives that they've lived. And it's fascinating. I mean, there's amazing and interesting people in the world, and it's really quite an honor to sit with them and to hear some of those experiences and to see, family dynamics, the number of family jokes that I get invited into just by nature of our conversations. And it's really lovely. Like it makes you see how much hope and positivity and optimism there is in the world, even in the face of such a huge endeavor that's coming. And I think, the value for me in terms of my work is just helping people come to terms and feel ready and prepared and supported through this process, and that there are people who are listening to them, people who don't just view them as a disease, but are viewing them as people and families with feelings and lives and something more than just what their diagnosis is. And so that, I think, has been, for me, what's kept me with transplant for so long and kept me with the liver team for so long. It's just every day is new and exciting and fulfilling.
It's such a good point that the disease becomes such a focus in their life, and yet their life is so much more than that. They still have, children or grandchildren or spouses and hobbies and interests, and the disease is not, it is an element of who they are, and it becomes increasingly overriding probably as they get closer to needing that transplant, but they are so much more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Jed?
So much of my participation in these discussions is a little abstract as we try to figure out the best infrastructure, and that can be intellectually engrossing, but it's also very rewarding to see how that works when it plays out well. That could mean an individual who's exploring living donation saying, you know what, I don't think this is right for me at this moment. I want to put this on pause. It could also be someone who donated and says, this was the best decision of my life. Now my spouse and I can travel together. But seeing those outcomes really enables me to connect my work with the human story.
That's really remarkable. Yeah. Now, we have a number of questions that have come in advance, and I think that Courtney, if I'm not mistaken, is going to maybe walk us through which ones we're going to go through. Here we go. So let's see them on the screen. All right, so the first one, okay, so over to Courtney, I think.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Heather. So the first question we have here is, what happens when someone dies in hospital? Who talks to the family about organ donation? Is spiritual care involved? Oh, Mark, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry about that. So I guess
No worries.
I can answer that one. Certainly spiritual care is involved. We are involved in most deaths that take place in the hospital. Often, in best case scenarios, we're involved prior to that, especially if there's an assigned spiritual care practitioner within the clinical program. That person will have met the family and the patient. We are not the ones that raise the question or option for organ donation, because we want to be able to journey and accompany families through whatever decision they will make. And so we don't want to be seen as coming from any particular standpoint or view. So normally it's the clinical team or the organ donation coordinator that would begin that conversation. And we are there to help families process through the questions that come up for them, their values, and the values of the patient as well.
Thank you, Mark. Next question here. What does the social work assessment cover? What factors would preclude a recipient or living donor candidate from moving forward?
I guess that's me. So from a recipient side, we really like to get a picture of who we're working with. So your family, your your day-to-day life, what you feel is important to you. We do an assessment on your financial situation, not to make a decision about going forward or not, but to provide some information and support and resources around what other resources you may be eligible for, drug coverage. We do a substance use and mental health assessment. We talk about motivation for transplant. If you've got any fears or worries, trying to help you feel comfortable with the decision. We certainly in my assessments, I do a lot of education around what to expect sort of from the time that you're listed while you're waiting for transplant, the call for transplant, what happens after, as I said, resources, and the living donor social work assessment does the same. When we talk about what would preclude someone from going ahead with transplant, every individual is different, and there's different scenarios that would lead to somebody not being able to go forward. In my experience, most things can be overcome. It just may take a little bit of time to get somebody to the point where they are ready for transplant. In some cases, there's medical issues that's primarily what happens. The medical issues stop you as a recipient or a living donor. But yeah, as I said, most of the time, things from a social work perspective that may preclude someone from going forward is more about a delay rather than fully stating somebody isn't suitable. Social support is a big one, though. We do know that our recipients and our donors need to have support for the most optimal outcome post-transplant. And so that is something that we focus on and we put a lot of weight on. But again, we work through some options and to see what could work.
Thanks, Sonali. So this question is from Len. Jed, I think this one will probably be for you. I know it's complicated, but has there been any further discussion on the possibility of exchanging more than one letter between non-directed living donors and recipients?
Yeah, just as background, one of the things that we think about is what the interactions between anonymous donors and recipients would ideally look like. Transplant programs across North America have taken a wide variety of approaches to facilitating communications between living donors and recipients post-transplant, ranging from maintaining almost complete anonymity if it's an anonymous, non-directed donation, to making introductions if the individuals are interested. UHN generally enables one letter to be exchanged, which reflects a philosophy of maintaining clean lines between anonymous, non-directed donation and other kinds of donation like directed donation, where you may have found someone online who is in need of an organ. However, we've received some feedback that this structure can create stress for participants in the transplant as they decide what they want to say in this letter or note and when. So we've initiated a process this fall of exploring the possibility of facilitating additional communication and what implications that would have at all stages of the transplant process. For example, we're thinking about, would that in any way affect how we assess people who present as potential donors? I'm cautiously optimistic that when the key stakeholders come together and think this through aloud, we can reach a consensus.
I think that's really helpful. As a non-directed donor, I can, this is certainly a discussion that comes up amongst other directed donors, and we all feel like for 100%, this is a gift freely given. We were honored to be able to give this gift, and we have no expectation of anything in return. This is their piece of liver now. And, I hope that they're doing amazing. And I know that one of the things that we struggle with is with the one letter rule is, if I write now, I gave to a child, I'm writing to the parents. And if the child has questions later, how do they get closure on that? Or how do they get answers that they might be looking for? But fully respecting the anonymity, no expectation to meet. And I have to say that as a non-directed donor, I am really, really appreciative of how receptive the center has been to this question. So when we started non-directed donors, Len and I and others started saying, we're not sure the one-letter rule works for us. I really appreciate how receptive Jed has been and the Center for Living Donation to kind of reopen the conversation and explore with us. So thank you for that.
It's a deliberative process, but we hear you.
Yeah, you do, and I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. I applied to be a living donor and completed most of the testing, then was eliminated due to a medical issue. I was devastated. Are there supports available to help me deal with this loss? Mark or Sonali, either of you want to take this question?
I'm happy to field it, Mark. If
Sure. Okay, Sonali. Yeah, that's fine.
Support. Maybe I'll kind of speak in a more global sense around support with transplant, because we do have some levels of support through the assessment process, but what we have, I think, is not always sufficient to cover all the needs of our patient population of recipients and donors. And I think we have some work to do in terms of being able to best meet the needs. So the yes and no answer to that question is a bit more difficult. There's probably some supports in the very initial phase of being turned down, but long term it's something that we're working on. We do have different avenues for support, but we're the Center for Living Donation, the Global Transplant Program. We are looking at ways to amp up our support resources for patients and their families. But it's still a big work in progress.
Wonderful. Mark, anything you want to add?
No, I think that Sonali's covered it well. Yes.
All right. Okay, the profound gratitude.
Can I put a plug in, actually?
Pardon me?
Can I put a plug in for one of our resources?
Absolutely.
So I should say we do have a really fantastic resource that was done internally by one of our mental health nurses, and it's called Coping with a Transplant. It is probably more recipient heavy than donor heavy, but it is a really great resource on sort of, what are normal feelings, what maybe aren't normal feelings, where to go for help. It's a really good resource that's transplant specific, which is very difficult to find. And of course, UHN has done it, so we're very proud of that. But I think it's a good starting point to use as a review, and then to seek out some additional support if what you read in there isn't enough.
Thanks. That is a really great resource. Thanks for sharing that. Next question. The profound gratitude of being a living organ recipient is overwhelming. It is difficult to absorb the magnitude of this gift. Is this a normal feeling?
I can start a response to that, and Sonali also, or Jen, might have additional points. I guess on a theoretical and mental level, I can appreciate the overwhelming sense it is, but I have to admit, not having been there, I can't grasp the depth of the emotional and psychological profound gratitude that is. Just a couple of reflections. It's interesting that often gratitude is something that we strive for. A lot of mindfulness now is around learning to be grateful. To be able to have a sense of gratitude in our life is supportive and builds resilience. So it's interesting to hear gratitude can also be a burden, or trying to that sense of gratitude. Two other observations. One is that I don't know if feelings are really normal. We have them. And if you are feeling that, then that's what your experience is, and to work with that experience. And maybe the best way to handle it, just as one option I would offer, is the best way to deal with gratitude is to express it. And so maybe it is to, on a yearly basis, to do some, and I'm a big ritual person, to do some ritual of gratitude for this. That that also might kind of take care of, absorb, express that sense of overwhelmingness.
Thank you. That's great advice. Anything you wanted to add on, Sonali?
I was just going to say my gut reaction to that question is I think it is a normal feeling. It's a huge gift to receive. I mean, it's a life and death gift. And I think it's absolutely normal to feel overwhelmed. But like Mark, I've not been there, so I can't speak specifically to the feeling. But I think it is a big give and a big gift that somebody has given. And I think it's heartwarming that it's a question that's being asked, because it means that somebody is thinking about this gift in a very meaningful way.
Absolutely.
If I could add from the donor side, we want to give that gift, and we hear from recipients sometimes that they are hesitant to accept it, or they feel like it's this huge gift. But every living donor that I ever talk to wants to give so badly, and is thrilled when we get accepted, and uses the word excited when they are talking about surgery, which sounds bizarre maybe, but the donors aren't looking for the gratitude. We were honored to be able to do it, and it doesn't take away from what the recipient feels, but it was a gift that we wanted to give.
Thanks, Heather. That's super valuable. Okay, so I think we're coming to an end here, but let's just do 2 more questions. Let's start with this one from Jed, or for Jed. In some countries, you can buy or sell organs. Is this illegal in Canada?
There's a quick answer to that. The Trillium Gift of Life Network Act, which set up Ontario's organ sharing infrastructure, broadly prohibits buying, selling, or dealing in human tissue for therapeutic purposes such as transplant. Additionally, we would admonish patients against traveling abroad to obtain a transplant in what may be medically risky and ethically problematic circumstances.
Great, thank you, Jed. We just got a comment in response to what Heather said. This person wholeheartedly agrees with you. As a donor, we're honored and so pleased to do this. Thanks for sharing that. So last question here. If a person has mental health issues, can they still get a transplant, or can they still be a donor? Sonali?
That's a bit of a loaded question, but I think I've said this before, every recipient and donor is assessed as an individual, and that includes their physical and mental health. So each situation does need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. The simple answer is that a mental health issue does not categorically preclude you from going forward with transplant or from being a donor. But ultimately, we want to make sure that whether you are a recipient or a donor, you are safe to go forward with transplant at that time. So I think stable mental illness and having the right supports, and just feeling like this is a safe decision and a comfortable decision for you is paramount. The actual diagnosis may or may not impact, depending on how medications may interfere, how the surgery may interfere. But at least from a psychosocial perspective, we're looking at safety. And that's where we'll look at the mental health issue. So it's not a clear-cut yes or no. It's case by case.
I would just second that from an ethical perspective, that when someone is deciding to donate, we want this to be a free and informed decision, and we have to be comfortable that the transplant makes sense from a risk-benefit perspective. But we want to make sure that we're not acting based on unfounded prejudices. We have to look at each individual case and ask, is this a stable condition? Is it something where the patient is likely to be able to withstand the stresses associated with transplantation, whether it is a mental health diagnosis or any other diagnosis in their chart?
Great, thank you. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We will answer and respond to the questions in the Slido link, so stay tuned there to get your answers. We'll also post them on our social media channels as well. Heather?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much to everybody who submitted questions, to everyone who joined us today, to our panelists for sharing your expertise and your very thoughtful answers. There are so many layers to the transplant process and so much care involved from the ethics and the psychosocial and the spiritual perspective. So thank you to all of you. Reminder to those of us who have joined to check out tomorrow's afternoon sessions. So tomorrow we've got In Conversation with Donors and Recipients, and that's moderated by a live donor kidney transplant recipient, Joanne Kearney and Dr. Joe Kim. And finally, we want to mention that we are exceptionally grateful for the generosity of our founding supporters. So that's Astellas Pharma Company and the Kearney and Cahill families. And thank you also to the Toronto General and Western Hospital Foundation for their continued support. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today and for your questions and for participating. And we look forward to seeing you soon.